Thank you so much, Mr. Rasheed Razvi and the learned speakers for this session. I'll be speaking on judicial activism in the context of social change. Actually, we all have been talking quite frequently in recent times about judicial activism, because we have seen a lot of that happening in Pakistan, and therefore judicial activism is a topic of interest quite a bit. But then to understand what is judicial activism, actually it's a term which we use very frequently, but we know very little about. We understand that judicial activism is something in which courts pass judgments in too many different kind of cases. But primarily internationally, you can say in other countries, they have tried to define judicial activism in the context of judicial restraint. What is not judicial restraint is judicial activism. Generally, the doctrine of judicial restraint have been followed very frequently all over the world, in the sense that judges are required to exercise restraint in exercise of their jurisdiction. It's not it is not something which is considered to be used more frequently. The courts have to exercise restraint over exercise of jurisdiction. And judicial activism has actually grown primarily after the Second World War. Most of the principles that were laid down about the judicial restraint were laid down in the times before Second World War, and some of the leading judges of the US Supreme Court have laid down those. So what I will say is that judicial activism is something which is opposed to judicial restraint, and therefore its parameters cannot really be defined. You know it when it is there. So therefore, by and large, consensus has been that judicial activism is something which can be beneficial, particularly in the exercise of social change that can be brought about as a result of the interventions of the judiciary on various times. And we have also noticed that judicial interventions have been harbingers of social change in various countries, particularly during the Second World War. I'll take specific examples. I don't want to go the topic. If we start discussing, it's a very large one, but I will go specific in certain areas where judicial activism have made some positive contribution towards social change in various directions. And some as a result of the judgments of the US Supreme Court, some as a result of Indian Supreme Court or Pakistani Supreme Court. As we know that the American society, even after they fought a civil war during 1860s over slavery, it still remained steeped in racial segregation. Despite that, the norms over there, even after the Civil War, did not really change their attitudes towards Negroes, and they continue to be exercising some form or the other racial segregation. And even at a point in time, around the end of the 19th century, the US Supreme Court also put a seal on racial segregation in a case which is known as Plessy versus Ferguson, when they said that if there can be separate portions or separate cars in a train for whites and non-whites, they said it's okay. It doesn't infringe against the equality clause, because if you provide equal kind of services separately, that doesn't mean separate but equal was the doctrine that they accepted, though it was inherently discriminatory. And took some time to change that, mindset. So in this is one of the examples in the mid-20th century, in a case in which very rarely Supreme Court of United States is unanimous in its judgments. Mostly the judgments are 5-4, 6-3, like that. This is one judgment in 1954 which was unanimous, in which they said that the separate but equal itself is discriminatory because segregation is discrimination. So when you have separate schools for whites and separate schools for blacks, it will certainly create an environment of discrimination and psychological inferiority amongst those who cannot go to those schools. And therefore, that's why they struck it down. And I think it is one of the great achievements made by the American judiciary that they forced the educational institutions, hospitals, public parks, universities, restaurants, housing schemes, and so many other such places to give up this segregation and not put conditions on the racial preference in those matters. So therefore, for that even they went a step higher, further by forcing the states to have busing for the children of one race to go to the schools where the other race, the children of other race were being educated. And similarly, this was true about the rail cars, this was true about the buses, it was true about all kind of other such public facilities. So that brought about a social change. As we understand, till 1950s or 60s, despite 100 years had passed since the Civil War over slavery, not much had changed in the USA socially. There was still a lot of discrimination. There still is a lot of discrimination even today. If we see what we see today, this political spectre by way of Trump is a remnant of those times who, despite all that is being said about American history, he still belongs to the original thought. And that's what he is. And so still there are a sufficient number of people living in the USA who will elect a person who believes in segregation, who believes in racial discrimination, who believes in all those kind of things. Things change very slowly. Social changes don't take place overnight. There will be still more Trumps. But the very fact that there has been an Obama itself indicates a social change. This was something which would have been unthought of some 100 years ago. So therefore, these judicial interventions, particularly in the case of racial discrimination, I think that has been a very, very positive sign over there. And this is one of to which the credit goes. No political party, no political leader would have brought about that. It is said about Eisenhower, he is the one who appointed Earl Warren as the Chief Justice of the United States, who gave this judgment. His court was perhaps the most liberal court in the US history. He said that one of the biggest mistakes I made of my presidency was to appoint Earl Warren as the Chief Justice. So therefore he did not approve this judgment. Even subsequently, it continued to be a political issue, whether this kind of judgments, this kind of interference, busing, forcible racial integration, is that something which is acceptable? No. Nixon was against it. So many other presidents have been against it. So it is, the credit goes to judiciary as far as I understand. No political party and political leader would have done it. Then another area in which a social change was brought about by the US Supreme Court intervention was the matter of pronouncing female right to choose abortion as a matter of her own choice, not being forced or not having to consult necessarily with her husband or with anybody else. So she was given in 1973 in a very famous case of 1973, Roe versus Wade, they accepted as a matter of fundamental right that a woman can choose to have abortion. And that is a very, the most controversial judgment of the US Supreme Court lately. It is also a political issue. In every presidential election, this is an issue. That how can we get the Roe versus Wade overturned? Because that is something which is, the whole conservative elements are working on that. And Trump and some of the state governments are very actively trying to find way to get rid of this judgment. But all the same must go to the credit of the judiciary, the US Supreme Court, that in the first place they gave such a bold judgment. And secondly, they still are sticking to it. Though at times the chances are getting narrower and narrower, with more and more conservative judges being sent by President Trump, there is every possibility that the abortion issue may lose a majority. And if it loses majority, maybe it get overturned. But so far, it has stood about 45 years, more than 45 years. And this is a social change, particularly defining the gender relationship in USA. The third area in which I will just mention over here would be some bold decisions which were against the traditions, social traditions of American social traditions. And there, for example, it was always considered that nursing is exclusively an area for females. So nursing schools were not usually admitting male students till very late, till 1960s. And it was in 1960 that it was held by the US Supreme Court that now you have to, and there cannot be even any gender discrimination in the matter of somebody who wants to study to become a nurse. So therefore, the doors were open for males to become nurses. Similarly, it was always considered that that fighting arms is the exclusive domain of the male, and females cannot enter into the schools where military academies or military schools where they are given military training, because it was expected till 1960s and 70s that females cannot be part of the fighting arm of any country's military. It was also changed, so much so Virginia had a very famous military school, still is there, and for 150 years they did not let a female enter into their Virginia School of Military Training, Military Academy. And ultimately it was on the judgment of the US Supreme Court that females were allowed to enter that academy and be trained as fighters. So that's again something which went against the social prejudices. This could not have been achieved through political process, but was achieved through judicial process. Now coming to India. In India also, I must say that Indian Supreme Court has contributed quite a bit about expanding the right to life. I only focus on right to life. Right to life and liberty is one of the basic fundamental rights in Pakistani Constitution under Article 9, and a similar article exists in Indian Constitution under Article 21. Under that article, it's a fundamental right to have life. It was Indian Supreme Court that defined or expanded the right of life to new boundaries, to new frontiers. So one of them, very important, was right to education. That yes, everybody has a right to life is meaningless if it is without education, because only education makes the right to life a life which is worthwhile, in which you can have job, you can economically progress, you can socially progress in life, you can contribute to the well-being of others, you can also contribute to your own well-being. So the recognition of right to education was one of the social changes that was brought about by them. The other, recognition of right to livelihood as part of right to life, is another area where they expanded, where the Indian Supreme Court expanded the right to life and gave it a new meaning. Meaning thereby, if you cannot earn your livelihood, you cannot live with honor. If the state does not provide you livelihood and you cannot live a life which is a useful life, which is beneficial to the society, then it's a meaningless thing. So therefore, by recognizing right to livelihood as part of the right to life, expanding that concept was again very creditable to them. Then even another area, right to have roads. Because there were certain areas in India, and of course there are such areas in Pakistan also, which don't have any access by roads. People cannot travel from those villages to any place from where they can go to a place where they can have their jobs, they can go to school, they can have education, all that. So giving this, that having access to by roads is something which is part of right to life, gave people a new social perspective and expansion towards the world as a whole, and by that way they could always progress in life. Then also right to life included, by they gave judgment, which meant the right to life means right to clean environment. Because life which is not lived in a good environment and clean environment, but this is something which is becoming a very, not only national, but is becoming an international and world issue, global issue. But Indian Supreme Court did recognize this, that the clean environment is something which is very, very important for a person, for the enjoyment of life, for a meaningful life, for a life that is worth living. So, therefore, this was another area of expansion. Then I'll come to Pakistan. In Pakistan, the area where Pakistani Supreme Court has particularly been instrumental in expanding right to life, expanding social interaction. One I would particularly provide for, which I refer to, is the right to medical education. This is the area where I must say that Pakistani Supreme Court did contribute in Shariah Munir's case, because earlier they had provided for quota. There's fixed number of seats given to the students, for female students, during admissions in all the medical colleges of Punjab. You could only have those many seats. And that was being interpreted, and there were very few, just 20% of the total seats would go to women. Remaining would go to the male students. And in that, a situation arose where the last person being admitted from amongst female applicants had much better grade than the last persons who were being admitted amongst the male applicants. So therefore, it was agitated that you are ignoring merit. Girls who had better grades and marks, they are not getting admission into the medical colleges, and that is unfair. The quota was meant to give them a minimum number of seats, not the maximum number of seats. And I must say the Pakistani Supreme Court in this case of Shariah Munir did expand on saying that the quota for female students for admission to medical college is a minimum quota, not the maximum. It is meant to benefit female students, female applicants, not meant to be to their detriment. And the argument which was rejected was that spending money on the medical education of female is not very useful expenditure of the state resources, because most of them go and get married and raise children and do not go to the medical profession. This this was a sort of prejudice which was there in social, which was overridden as a result of this education. So therefore, these are few instances just I wanted to point out where judicial intervention, or say judicial activism, if we want to call that in this context, has contributed positively towards change in the social change or the social equation that exists in the society. Thank you so much.